Steve Carlson here. Michelle McDonald, a spunky candidate whom I endorsed to be on the Minnesota Supreme Court in place of David Lillyhouse, told the Twin Cities Press this week that you are the fourth estate and they should be less lazy and should investigate issues like the intense partisanship in Minnesota elections. So partisan that even within the parties are too partisan to function. But I believe Michelle, who I think would be an extremely valuable addition to the Supreme Court, replacing Al Franken's elections attorney, is wrong on this. The fourth estate in Minnesota is not really the press. They're the fifth estate. Minnesota's fourth estate is the parties and the PACs. They are the machinery of elections and the machinery of government. They are not private organizations or associations that are separated from the regulation of the U.S. Constitution or of the Congress or the legislature. They have constitutional rights fundamental to our free system of government and are governed by constitutional requirements. And if Michelle is elected, which I seriously hope she will be, I hope she will be voting to that effect, because I believe that is lawful and just, and that to allow out-of-control parties controlled by powerful groups of political insiders to suppress Minnesota democratic government in the selection of representatives is unconstitutional, unlawful, and makes a sham of free and fair elections that are so fundamental to our system of government and regulated liberties. And by that I mean liberties that are protected by law. Now, in McDonald's case, a real estate attorney named Patrick Burns appears, according to her evidence submitted to the state, to have criminally threatened and in a sense stalked her as a candidate for the Minnesota Supreme Court. This is manipulating and distorting the very highest court in the state, without which our rights as persons subject to the jurisdiction of the state cannot be enforced, cannot be vindicated. And the corruption of Keith Downey and the GOP is that they wanted to knock her off the ticket and put their own favored candidate in. Meanwhile, David Lillyhouse over here on the ballot is Al Franken's elections attorney in 2008. The one who found all those votes and got the Supreme Court to elect Al Franken, who was not really elected in the count of Minnesota voters, but by the Supreme Court with Lillyhouse as Franken's attorney. And Mark Dayton quickly swooped in and appointed Lillyhouse, as well as Wilhelmina Wright, to the court. Did you know that we elect the judges whom you will see on your ballot because it's required in our Minnesota Constitution? And yet we have Al Quie leading a movement on the part of lawyers, the professional bar, to change the Constitution, to take the power out of the people's hands and put it in the lawyers' hands. I would argue Mark Dayton violated the Minnesota Constitution, certainly frustrated its intent when he personally appointed Wright and Lillyhouse instead of allowing the election to take place first. And surely these professional lawyers, who members of the press like Lori Sturdivant fawn over like they're her uncle, these lawyers of the Supreme Court who arranged to give this power to Dayton and to the bar, usurp power out of the hands of we, the Minnesota voters, because they personally benefit from the arrangement. That Minnesota Supreme Court is the one who conspired with a Ramsey County judge to block a congressional finding required by the U.S. Constitution on whether the DFL should have been allowed to have gender and race and sexual preference quotas in all decisions of the party, including adopting procedures, platforms, and endorsements, and allowing the state of Minnesota to force white male voters away from the precinct caucuses for the DFL. Our Minnesota Constitution specifically secures the right to vote in the DFL precinct caucus, and they allow Mark Ritchie and Lori Swanson and Mark Dayton and slick hustlers inside the DFL party like Keith Ellison and Betty McCollum to take that right away in violation of the 19th Amendment and 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And they force white males to stay away, or others who disagree, with this practice, which is enshrined as a protected principle under the constructions of these members of the Minnesota Supreme Court. I'll tell you right now, it kept me away as a voter and as a candidate because I cannot agree with these so-called principles of quotas and discrimination. How can I run against Betty McCollum within the DFL while disagreeing that Betty has a right to require 50% or more of the voting delegates to be women, while restricting white males, such as myself, to 35 to 40% of the voting delegates? And why should we even be talking about the gender and race and sexual behavior of the delegates, rigging the party and the elections so they are no longer free and fair? So what I'm telling you is that all the three major parties, the DFL, the GOP, and the Independence Party, are corrupt, controlled by slick and misguided political pros and insiders. So many of the voters used to talk about term limits for office holders as the way to fight corruption and incompetence. I'm telling you, if we can have parties not governed by partisan corruption, where you can participate and I can participate, and we can talk about the issues, and we can track the actions of our representatives and fashion new ideas and new leadership, which we need constantly because the challenges facing this nation are always new and challenging. We can beat back the corruption and incompetence that symbolizes Minnesota government at this time. Voting is not enough. We must stay informed, and we must devote ourselves to creating and sustaining a government which will indeed represent our highest purpose as a nation, including but not limited to the fierce protection of our individual liberties, family rights, including human life, and religious and intellectual liberties. How often do we even talk about these things? I mean, is it polite to be political? To raise these complex and abstruse subjects in normal company without getting paid, out of love for our nation and our people? In case you're wondering, yep, I had to look that one up. Abstruse, difficult for one of ordinary knowledge or intelligence to understand. Is it even polite to ask somebody about an abstruse subject which the government needs to act on, or a policy they need these representatives that we vote for to act on? One party I had hoped for, the Minnesota Independence Party. They are supposedly radical centrists, not wedded to the corrupt organization of the Minnesota Democrats, but not so comfortable that they ignore the issues, like country club Republicans, comfortable Republicans like Keith Downey, who can dispatch a Supreme Court justice candidate from the ballot because she was endorsed by his own private club. Comfortable country club players who can dispatch teams of lawyers to intimidate a duly nominated candidate to take over the state's high court. And let me stress, I'm not turning negative. It is not negative to oppose corruption. It's positive. It brings the government to life. I was inspired by such words from presidents from John Kennedy to Ronald Reagan. Some people might look similarly at Barack Obama. Perhaps he opens up their dreams of freedom and equality. But we don't need to break ceilings or kick down doors. We need to put the life and wisdom into the patient, the United States of America, and the 50 states. How do we do this? I listened to Obama's Democratic Convention speech some years ago with interest, but did not know at the time that his ideals were couched in such a radical, often racial ideology. When the people say, take America back, put America on the right course again, we're not being dogmatic, status quo, extremists. We are saying, bring our government and its bedrock, the Constitution, and the rights of conscience it protects back to life. I say to Barack Obama, follow the Constitution. If you continue to abandon the Constitution, I'll vote to impeach. But if he follows it, returns to it, does the will of the framers and of Almighty God, I will back away from the impeachment table. He represents the corruption of the Democrats with the corruption of the Republicans waiting in the wings, attracted by that bloated national budget of $3 to $4 trillion annually. So to make America well, not bloated, with 50 healthy states, by neutralizing the corruption in elections and parties, that is positive, that is life-giving. Obama's DFL argues that I and so many others are on the wrong side of history. Oprah Winfrey and others said that what needs to happen is old white men need to die off. Then things will be great. I just hope she doesn't put out some new recipe or how to live book that instructs her fans to carry it out. That's a joke. I'm being sarcastic on that one. I want the DFL to follow the Constitution. I want the Supreme Court to supervise free and fair democratic elections in Minnesota. And I want an Independence Party of Minnesota that is a voice, a hope, and a purpose for the 41% of Minnesota voters who are alienated from the Democrats and Republicans, and I think also the Independence Party. They don't necessarily identify with the Independence Party, but they should. And we should construct and lead the party to have a much broader discourse with the Minnesota voters on a whole range of issues of national importance. Jobs, consumer protection, economy, foreign policy, defense and homeland security, privacy, liberty, religious and family rights, education, health care, immigration. The list is enormous, too long to recount. I believe it is our duty as a free people, if we are to remain free, to take this up. Don't talk about your gender. Don't talk about your race. Don't talk about injustice in the past. We all have a past full of injustice. What will we replace it with? Where will we find freedom and justice? We know that real education, family rights, individual liberties, and the ability to invest in productive enterprise has enriched us, even put us for a time in the leadership of the world. People look to us for hope and leadership and even freedom. How can we lead if we do not take our duties seriously? I'm prepared to do that, to put in the hard work, to provide leadership in the Senate. I will not promise to work across the aisle. Why construct an aisle? I will not promise to end the gridlock. I do not respect any gridlock. Filibusters, deliberation, that I respect. It appears that Candace may send an independent senator to the U.S. Senate, raising the number to 3 out of 100. Send me, that makes 4. What I will promise is to make the United States Senate work. I will move it forward on all these issues we discuss. I am not naive. I'm a political science major, decades of experience in political leadership in the state, nearly a decade as a newspaper editor, a lifelong learner, as well as someone who believes all our hopes lie in doing God's will. But I'm not naive, I just have faith. I want the IP, the Independence Party, to be free of corruption. I don't want the party to demand a litmus test for homosexuals, to tell others that there is a new normal, that they are in charge and will take away your rights of conscience. A small operation rebranded to push through vices like recreational use of drugs or liquor on Sundays as their idea of a liberty agenda. I want to remove the litmus test. This didn't just happen in 2014 with Mark Jenkins. When I first ran with the party in 2010, Tom Horner was an enthusiastic candidate full of ideas like pro-growth agenda for Minnesota governor. But at the state fair in 2010, I was told by his running mate, Jim Mulder, to stay away from the Independence Party tent because I'd get in Horner's and Mulder's way. And I asked Mulder his opinion of Obamacare, and he told me, take the money, always take the money. He didn't have Horner's nuance and subtlety. And I was also told by party insiders in 2010 that they'd taken care of the problem, as it were, of those who supported traditional marriage and would not support its destruction. And so I knew very well that in 2014 I could not approach these kinds of ideologues, of social engineers, not true lovers of our sacred liberty, for support. Thankfully, the voters of the state have put me in the general election. If you elect me, I will continue to work to restore the U.S. and Minnesota constitutions over the actions of corrupt federal judges across this nation who confuse judicial activism with social justice. And I will work to free up our elections so you may participate meaningfully, and parties will not be so partisan that they will fight those whom the voters choose with insider unrestrained power. The millennials are not just focusing on marijuana and homosexuality, just as women are not actually obsessed with abortion or even government-controlled wages, as if Barack Obama could somehow force private employers to set wages by gender. Black voters do not just care about police misconduct. Even though that is a serious issue we must address always, we must not allow it to be a metaphor for black voters, a wedge issue. We want to normalize relations with Mexico and secure the border, but immigration must not stand for how we see or treat those of Hispanic origin. This I learned from my grandfather, a successful bullfighter in Mexico, who loved the Mexican people and taught me the same. China's immense economic power and Asia's economic power and even military prowess must not become a metaphor for Asian Americans. Terrorism must not be allowed to become a metaphor for the peoples of the Middle East or Africa. We must be one, not many, and breaking down the Minnesota quota in the DFL party and letting some air in the parties as we recommit towards saving our freedom for future generations is the step I believe you need to take as you vote. And please come out and vote in the November 4th elections. I'm Steve Carlson, and I approve this message.